Alrighty, group, welcome back to our In the Inbox series, answering question number 122. This is a weekly series where we answer questions that have been asked to us by folks who are looking at the real estate industry here in Belize. So we're going to answer this question from Stephen, and he lives in Australia. He's looking at property here in Belize, and he wanted to know if he's able to buy the property from Afar. Does he need to come from Australia to Belize to close on the property? And this is a really great question, especially because in a lot of countries, you do need to physically be there in the country, or you need to sign a power of attorney in order to have a closing company or an attorney close on your behalf if you are not physically going to be there. It's a little different here in Belize, but the good news is that you are able to close from afar. And it is actually really quite simple. I would say actually a lot of folks tend to not come down during the closing process. They'll tend to come down after the property is already closed. So then that way they can enjoy the property that they're purchasing. But we're going to go through what the closing process looks like and then important things for you to note as we are going through this process. So generally, I broke it down into 4 different steps. The first step when you're looking for properties, of course, identifying the property that makes the most sense to you. And then when you find that property, your realtor is going to write up an offer to purchase, a written offer to purchase. Within that offer to purchase, you're going to have certain contingencies. You're going to have your offer price, of course, all the things that you would expect to be standard. I would recommend that you reach out to your real estate agent and ask them to send you a template of an offer to purchase so that when you find the property that's right for you, you already know what to expect and you understand what that agreement looks like. All right, so let's say we get the offer to purchase completed and the seller agrees to it. This can all be done through e-signatures. I know our company, we use DocuSign here, but there are a lot of different verified e-signature companies. However, both parties will sign off on the document. And again, within that document, you're going to have contingencies. You're going to have a handful of things that you and your realtor are going to go through. Step 3 is once your offer gets accepted, you're going to be connected to the closing company. I know real estate agents and realtors, they tend to have their preferred closing companies or attorneys. We've typically gone through a lot of closing companies to find the really, really good ones for you to work with. However, if you want to do your own due diligence and your own homework on a closing company, I would definitely recommend you can do that. However, make sure that part is done prior to you putting in an offer to purchase, because at that point, that's when the clock is ticking. And that's when you're going to be introduced to the closing company, who's also typically the escrow company. We're going to break down number 3 a little bit further in the next step, because this is really where that 6 to 8 weeks of close really happens. And I want to break that part down for you a little more specifically. And then step 4 is when you close and you take possession, and the closing company at that point is going to send you what they call an LRS number or an LTU number. This is a tracking instrument number where you're able to track the progress of that physical title through the lands department. All right, so let's break down step 3 a little bit more. So the first part, after the offer has been completed by both parties, you're introduced to the closing company. You're going to send, typically it's a 10% earnest deposit to the escrow company while you're going through this first part, which is the due diligence period. This is typically about 3 to 4 weeks. You'll send that 10% earnest deposit, and then you're going to be going through the contingencies. So common contingencies, and this is one I always recommend regardless of what type of property you're buying, is a title check. That's going to be done for you by the closing company. They're going to check to make sure that the name on that sales agreement matches who the verified and legal owner of the property is. We do not have a public registry here. So this is something that you really need to have a closing company or an attorney do for you. In addition to that, a couple of other contingencies typically are going to be an inspection or a land survey, and these typically need to be done within 10 to 15 business days of the offer being accepted. So those are typically the contingencies that you're going to have in part 1. Once everything looks good and the contingencies are lifted, then we go into part 2 of the close. And this typically takes about 3 to 4 weeks. So the land, or there's the deed of conveyance or the transfer of land, depending where in the country you are. The properties are titled a little bit differently depending where in the country you are, but these are the 2 documents that are going to be used regardless of where in the country you are. They're going to be issued by the closing company to you. So this is the document that you need to put your wet signature on in front of a notary. And then it's going to be mailed back to either the closing company or to the seller. Each closing company does it a little bit differently in terms of the order that they're sending these documents to, but the closing company will explain to you what you need to do. Typically, they do not want you to date it because they're going to be dating it once they submit it to the lands department, but you do need to sign it in front of a notary. So this is important. And this is really where that wet signature is going to be required. This is why you don't need to come down to Belize in order to close on property, because this part right over here is what you're able to do in front of a notary. And all of this takes about 3 to 4 weeks because you have to factor and bear in mind that people are traveling. You know, some people may live like Stephen in Australia. So it takes a little bit of time for documents to get to where they need to be. Part 3, 7 days before closing, typically you'll send the remaining balance to the escrow company. The escrow company is the closing company, so you'll send the rest of the balance to the company. And then the closing company is going to ask you to sign a closing statement, and they're going to ask for your permission to release funds. So this is when they have all of the documents in order. They have everything back. All the documents have the wet signature. They've been signed in front of the notary. They have the due diligence documents. They have the signed closing statements from both parties. At this point, they're going to ask you to release funds. You're going to say, okay. And then at that point, then you take possession. So the property is yours. And at this point, once the property is yours, then typically takes a couple of days, but the closing company is then going to register the transaction with the lands department. And this is when you get the LRS number or the LTU number. You are able to track your close, your title issuing through a government website, which I can put that link in the description below. But this is to show that your property purchase has been registered. In Belize, it typically takes about 18 months to get that physical piece of paper that says that title, right? That's printed on the cardstock. The original, do not ever lose that document, but that typically takes about 18 months to get. However, the property has been registered once you receive that LRS number or the LTU number. So that is really important to remember. So that is essentially step 3 broken down. It typically takes about 6 to 8 weeks to close on a property, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit shorter. I will say though, a lot of times we've seen closings get delayed. It's really not uncommon here. I know in the States, like you're never late for a closing, right? It's never delayed. But here, because there are so many moving pieces, because there are documents that need to be signed in front of a notary and then mailed off, it takes a little bit of time to get that done. So if you want to come down and you want to spend time in your property, let's say you're buying a finished home or a condo, and you have that closing date set for July 1st, I would not book a plane ticket down until you know that the property has been paid, has been closed, and that you are in possession of it. Because if the closing is delayed and you're on that plane, you're planning to spend time in your property on July 1st, but the closing hasn't happened yet, then you're not going to be allowed because it's technically and legally not yours at that point. Possession hasn't been handed over. So just some really important things for you to note. But yes, the really good news is you can do all of this from afar. You just have to have access to a notary to be able to sign the documents in front. If you're planning to own real estate here in Belize, we have a closing guide. So what I just went through, I have it a lot more detailed. I'm happy to send that over to you. It is really important that you understand this closing process as you're going through the close, or as you're looking at property here, because that's going to help set your expectations for timelines, what you should be receiving from the closing company, what sort of contingencies that you should be expecting, and everything along those lines. I actually have one more point I want to make a note of. This is here for part 4. I said the closing company will send you your LRS or LTU number that to show that your property has been registered. If you're taking advantage of seller financing, if you're listening to me, this is very, very important. If you're taking advantage of seller financing, the title is not transferred until the property has been paid off in full. So you will not get an LRS or LTU number. The original title is there with the escrow company. And once the property is paid off in full, that's when they do the land transfer for you. However, the closing company, who's acting as that escrow company, they're holding on to that physical deed to ensure that the property cannot be sold. So that is really, really important. A lot of folks have done seller financing here. It's a great method if you don't have all the cash to put down, but just understand that little caveat if you are taking advantage of seller financing. All right, folks, that wraps up our question 122 of In the Inbox today. Feel free to reach out. If there's any other information you want to hear from me, just put that in the comment section below. We'd love to get more questions answered for you, because I can bet you are not the only one who has that question on your mind. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you here in Belize. Bye, everyone.